The god's wood was older than any promise a man could keep. In winter it breathed a clean, cold breath. In summer it held the shade and secrets the keep had grown around it like a stubborn child clinging to its mother. The heart tree's red leaves, wet from a night mist, lay in the grass like pages torn from an old book. Bran sat beneath the carved face and listened. Most who came to pray heard nothing but the wind and their own thoughts. Bran heard the roots. He heard the slow, sodden, subterranean labor of 1,000 threads sunk into black soil, drinking meltwater and memory. He felt, as if through skin, the way those threads tethered Winterfell to all the places a white tree had taken hold and endured axes and flames and the little scorn of men. He knew where the bark had been scored by a child with a jagged stone years ago, the mark carried forward in the wood's secret rings, and he knew the path the leaf mold took as it drifted toward the rills that led to the stream. He knew, too, what the trees remembered and could be made to remember again. It was not the same as seeing. It was not sight. It was a choked whisper in the cavity of a bone, a color glimpsed wrong way up in the eye, a taste that belonged to someone dead and to a day that had run off down the hill and out of the yard. It was the way a song lived in the body after the last note had gone, the way a touch could be recalled more vividly than a face. When he breathed now, the gods would breathe with him. He had learned to keep his mind's hand still, so as not to stir the water for no need. Peace demanded a steady hand. Beyond the pale trunks and their bleeding leaves, the keep was beginning to wake. The smoke hole of the great kitchen had sent up its first hesitant ribbon. It would thicken into a column by the time the sun slid free of low cloud. He could smell ash and onion, oats bluntly sweet as they simmered, the fat of bacon that would never quite be enough for the number of hands held out to receive it. A smith's gentle tapping began in the yard. A dog barked once and then, told where it stood by the bark of a voice, went silent. The ravens above the rookery clattered and croaked as they sorted the day's quarrels amongst themselves. Bran's breath steamed, then faded. He leaned his head back against the heart tree and let his eyes close. Sleep, when it came in pieces. Dreams had never stayed in their pens. Not since the cave and the long apprenticeship that had ended with him crawling out into daylight and looking with a changed eye upon his home and the people who walked within it. He slept because he had learned the price of not sleeping. And when he woke, he kept still and he listened to the roots. A squirrel flung itself down one trunk, stopped, and fixed him with its bright distrust. He smiled at it without moving. Its tail was the color of honey on toast. It darted away, claws clicking softly. He felt the tiny scrape as if in his own palm. "Bran," a voice said, low as if he were still asleep. "Boy." Bran opened his eyes and twisted to look. His father stood halfway between the tree and the pool, his boots wet and his jaw shadowed with a day's beard. Eddard Stark had never stopped keeping early hours. There was a carefulness about him that had nothing to do with stealth and all to do with respect. Respect for his household's rest, for the godswood's quiet, for his own thoughts before duty took hold and shook them apart. Bran felt a brief, fierce joy that was always a surprise when it came. He had taught himself to carry love like a lamp sheltered in the cup of his hand. But seeing his father in the godswood, alive and solid and weathered by years that Bran had not always been sure he'd have, the lamp flared. "You were a ghost," Ned said, settling himself by the tree and stretching one long leg, the leather creaking. "I watched you a while as if I'd never seen you before. How long have you been here?" "I don't know," Bran said honestly. "Since before the crows woke." Ned nodded, taking that without comment. His eyes moved over the heart tree's face and rested in the long grooves the carver's blade had made, the deep cuts that held and shed water in different ways than the bark around them. "It rained in the night." "Mist," Bran said, and Ned tipped his mouth in acknowledgement. For Bran had always had a precise ear for weather. They sat a while in companionable silence while somewhere a kitchen girl began to sing as she chopped, and the knife's rhythm shaped the song. A wagoner on the distant road called to his team. The ravens forget their feuds and left the rookery on the same wind. Ned said, finally, "Your sisters due back before noon, if the river god allows the fords to run kindly." I thought to meet her at the gate if you'll come. Sansa. Bran nodded. I will. Ned plucked a thread from his sleeve. She writes as if she were 3 women at once, he said, the corner of his mouth yielding to a smile. One of them is Lady of Winterfell down to the syllable. One of them is a girl still radiant with every new sight. And one writes like a ledger, with lines and prices and the sort of numbers that make men honest against their inclinations. What does she charge for the sight of a flowering crabapple? Bran asked lightly. Ned looked at him sidelong. Far too dear, he said, and when Bran laughed, his father's smile broadened, and something eased in him. She sent word of the terms struck with Gulltown, and of the harbormaster's son who dearly wishes to be thought indispensable. She sent me the salt yield of last winter when the wind was wrong for 3 weeks straight. And she sent me a bit of lace from the Vale that looks delicate as frost and is strong enough to tow a cart. Your mother admires it very much. Mother pretends not to care for lace, Bran said. But she keeps all of it in the top of her chest and touches it when she worries. Ned's eyebrows rose. I don't spy on Pop. Lou. Bran added, quiet. Not like that. You know I don't. I know, Ned said at once. I know what you are and what you aren't. Bran shifted his shoulders, and the heart tree pressed cool and damp through his back. Sometimes I think I learned too much to ever earn the peace I've helped to make, he said. Ned didn't ask him to explain. That was one of the mercies of his father. He never demanded a boy's small heart made large enough to carry a man's truths. He said, peace is something we make each day and then guard, like embers. It never keeps itself. Bran listened to the words and to the root speech beneath them and to the way his father's hand had picked up a bit of moss without realizing it. He felt the damp grit as if in his own palm again and wanted suddenly to put his forehead against his father's shoulder the way he had when he was small. Instead he looked where light broke on the pool and said, as if it were a different subject, I think of heat rising off the stones of the great September. I think of the way a crowd sounds when it's frightened and angry. I think of birds. Ned's breath came in and went out and came in again. He rubbed the moss between his fingers to a paste. Once, he said carefully, when I was being taken somewhere I did not choose, a wind came over the square by Baelor's statue. It was the wrong wind. It smelled of pine and snow and cold iron. And I thought, for no good sense at all, of the curve of a boy's cheek when he slept and the way your mother tucks her lower lip between her teeth when she thinks hard. It was a foolish thought and a foolish place for it. There are oddnesses one remembers without being able to speak them aloud. Bran sat very still. A raven passed over the godswood, its shadow crossing their faces, one after another in a single breath. I have oddnesses you've never heard tell, Ned said almost cheerfully, as if they were making small talk. Some I set aside because there is work to be done and the work will not do itself. Some I keep because they're dear even if I don't know why. The older I get, the less I think it matters which is which. He brushed his palms off on his breeches and stood. Come with me. Your mother has decided to send a basket to the village widow whose boy mends nets by the river, and if I don't carry it myself, she will send a groom, and he won't know to ask after the old woman's chest and stool. And then the day will be worse than it needs to be. Bran nodded and rose, leaning for a moment on the trunk. He had grown into his height in an odd way, as if he had been stretched by a gentle hand that was not entirely careful. He took a breath and the gods would breathed with him. The sound the leaves made might have been agreement, or merely wind among leaves. They left by the little gate near the mews and crossed the yard where the training yard sand had been freshly raked. A brace of boys held tourney lances upright and pretended they were taller than they were. Hob huffed past them with a tray of pies that steamed and made the cold air smell of fat and pepper. The stable smelled as it always had. Sweet muck and leather, horseflesh warm as a living loaf. A gate swung open on a courtyard where the fountain's lip was rimed, delicate with the glass of thin ice that would break at a touch. Bran broke it and let it go dark again without comment, and his father didn't remark on the impulse. They had learned over long seasons when to let silence carry the weight. Catelyn found them at the covered well, a shawl around her shoulders and another in her hand. Her hair was threaded with more winter than last year. The lines around her eyes had been cut by laughter as much as by fear. She had woken before dawn to speak with a man who had ridden all night with nothing but a bridle. She had fed him hot soup with her own hands because he trembled too much to hold the bowl and because it pleased her to do so. She had sent him on with a changed horse and a scrap of John Umber's joke to keep him warm. She stood now with a shawl in her hand that she had mended twice. "Don't carry both ends of the basket like last time," she told Ned, "or you will twist your back and pretend you haven't." She kissed Bran's cheek and watched him for a moment as if every now and then she needed to make sure he was not an idea she had cherished too long. "There are biscuits in the basket," she told Bran. "They like to go soft if they're left a day, so make sure they're eaten quickly by someone who has no teeth. And tell the net mender I have that salve for his cracked hands he asked after last month. I forgot to send it on market day." "I'll ask after his stool," Ned said deadpan, and she swatted at him with the shawl and then used it to wrap him up because she had hands and couldn't help themselves from doing what they were made to do. Outside the inner gate, Winterfell extended into the bailey the way a tree throws roots beyond a stone wall. The smithy there was smaller than Micken's and always busy with the work that didn't need Micken's broader shoulder. A woman hammered a rivet into a pot while her daughter pumped the bellows, careful and solemn as priestesses. A group of spearwives from the easternmost villages, spears slung points down, listened while a steward told them where to stand if they preferred not to be pressed by the crowded stalls later in the day. A man selling early winter apples had his wares stacked in a neat scenting heap, their skins bruised in places but still sweet. He had two left and a look that said he'd become suddenly less certain he could make the next rent. Ned paused long enough to buy them both and hand one to a boy tugging a goat by a piece of rag. The boy looked at Bran the way small boys always looked at him, with the boldness of curiosity. Bran smiled and asked after the goat's name, and the boy said, "He's not mine," and ran off with his apple as if he had stolen it from luck. The widow's hut was by the river path, blue smoke rising from a patched roof. It was swept clean as a thumb. A skein of dried reed hung from the lintel with a charm woven into it that had more faith than craft. When the old woman stood in the door, she leaned more heavily than spring on a staff. "Lord," she said, and then to Bran, "Little one of roots," which he pretended not to mind though the back of his neck warmed. "We brought biscuits," Catelyn had said to send him with, but Ned said it carefully, and the old woman's mouth softened as if the word itself were a kindness. She took the shawl with 3 fingers as if measuring its weight against something else in the room. "The boy was away mending nets," she said, "but there was stew on the fire, and if they'd sit a minute, she'd spoon them a taste and they could tell her if she'd misjudged the salt." Ned's face closed and opened again on acceptance. They sat on stools that had been rubbed by hands for 3 generations, and the steam rose with the same smell you could find in 1,000 kitchens. Potatoes and a scrap of meat stretched by skill, thyme that had dried too quickly, onion. It was good and it was not enough, but for that moment it was just what it was. On the way back, the morning began to flex itself into day. The sun came out in a sudden, brittle cleaner. The river ran as if to a purpose. A man with a sack of feed told a story about a fox that had learned each gate of Winterfell by smell and had made fools of all the dogs for a week together. A girl dropped a ribbon and did not see. Bran picked it up and gave it to her, and she thought her luck had changed. At the outer gate, an outrider sat his horse breathing a little hard, the animal fretting from the long trot and the press of the stable's smell beyond. Oats and straw and the knowledge of rest. "Ravens from White Harbor, my lord," he said, saluting with 2 fingers off his brow. "Sailed last on the turn of the tide." Ned looked to Bran and Bran looked past the man's shoulder, because the Godswood had already told him there would be 3 messages, and that one would be written by a hand that had learned to write on a rocking ship. It pleased him, still, to take the knotwork of the day as it came to hand. "Bring them to the Solar," Ned said, and to Bran added, "Tell your mother your sister's tutor from Gulltown is 2 days behind her. We'll need to find rooms that are not so near the kitchens. Fancy men faint if they smell their dinner before it is dressed in its proper saucer." When they came into the yard, Arya was standing on 1 foot on a narrow fence rail with her arms out and her eyes shut. Her hair had mostly escaped from its leather thong. the Master of Arms, a compact man whose forearms were a map of scars and sun, stood close by with a switch, ready to tap her calf if she took her balance for granted. "You cheat," Arya said without opening her eyes as Bran came up. "You breathe in a way that lets me hear your face. And you talk in a way that lets me hear the grin under your nose," Bran returned. "What will you do if a man breathes only through his ear?" "Cut his ear off," Arya said simply. She wobbled and recovered without falling. "Some men," the Master of Arms put in, not unkindly, "put steel where you think they have meat. The world doesn't hold still while you learn it, girl." "The world owes me a slow dance," Arya said, and this time when she wobbled she came down with a thump and a laugh. She took Bran's waist in her grubby hands and spun him, so he had to catch a gatepost to keep from falling. "You'll make me drop my brother, and my mother will put pockets of stones in your boots," she told the Master, who smiled with his whole face and shook his head. "Where have you been?" "Listening to trees," Bran said. Arya pulled a face. "Listen properly," he added, as their father disappeared into the inner keep. "Sansa's letters say she's bringing you something that isn't a dress, and you will be rude if you don't look as if you like it." "I'll love it," Arya said at once, which did not mean that she would. "She writes as if every page of her is a different girl. You can smell the sea on one," she added, surprising him, "and the top of a man's head on another. That's what they smell like. Men who stand at the prows of ships and think their ship moves because of the shape of their jaw." Bran laughed before he could stop himself, and Arya looked pleased to be the cause. "Sansa says this man taught her to count the wind," she went on with sudden seriousness. "She says you can count the wind if you look at canvas and water and think both at once." "You can count the wind," Bran said, "but you have to be willing to be wrong at the same time." "Then I'd be good at it," Arya said, nodding. She peered into his face. "You look tired and proud at once. I don't like that combination." "You've never liked any combination that wasn't you and a sword," Bran told her. But when she rolled her eyes, he looped an arm around her neck and pulled her close long enough that she felt the sincerity under the jest. "Don't fall off any railings today," he added, and made his way into the hall. The solar was warm with the low, steady heat of a fire burning for hours. Maps weighted at the corners lay on the table. One showed trade roads with pebbles in the bowls of the inns. The pebbles were sorted by color to show which kitchens fed a rider best. Bran had started that, and now winter riders argued about it like a matter of banners. Another showed the northern coast. Little pins marked shoals, and a cross showed where nets too often tore. Ned stood behind the desk, the 3 scrolls in their cracked leather bands arrayed before him. Catelyn sat with a writing board on her lap, pouring sand back into its little horn with a steady hand. She had already sealed one letter with the wolf and the sword pressed in. "The first is from the Manderly who was a baker before he was a lord," she said dryly. "He's proud of his bread." "He ought to be if it keeps men from dying," Ned murmured without looking up. He cracked the seal on the second. "This one is the harbor ledger, Sansa's hand," he added, and lifted the neat columns and the freckling of tea where some sloppy salt had splashed, and held it up to his eye like a man admiring an etching. "The third is from the Sea Lord's man through White Harbor. He writes like a man who thinks every letter he scratches is a coin he can spend twice. He broke it too. He wants to send a man to see the giants." "There are no giants," Catelyn said. "There are stories we tell children when we want them to be brave." "There are giants," Bran said softly, without looking up from the map. "They keep their names like coal they won't show you. They carry them inside. They smell like smoke and wet wool. If he comes north thinking it's a tale, he'll lose his hat and his horse." Catelyn's hands became still over the board. Ned folded the Sea Lord's letter at once and set it aside. "Then we'll send a man to meet him at the Long Lake," he said matter-of-factly, as if they were speaking of lambing. "Someone with sense in his boots." "Torrhen would go," Catelyn said. "Torrhen will go," Ned agreed. "And he'll take men who know how to come home from a story. We'll send word to Lady Manderly that the price for the Sea Lord's man's protection is a crate of lemons." Your mother made a face at the last stew because it had no tartness to it. He added to Bran, too fast for Catelyn to pretend not to smile. What says White Harbor about the price of timber this winter? Catelyn asked, back to her ledger voice in an instant. They have more coin than they did last year and will want to buy the shipwright's favor. It says your daughter disagrees with them and has already written to 3 men without their knowing, Ned said, and the line around his mouth that sometimes suggested iron softened. Bran let his fingers hover above the coast map. There was a grain ship somewhere between Sisterton and the Neck that had decided on a course the captain would regret. They would put in at dusk because the captain had a habit of trusting the last gray of daylight more than the first black of night. The shoal there had shifted a finger's breadth in last month's storms. He could write to the lighthouse keeper and tell him to trim the lamp a different way tonight. He could lay a branch on the path of a storm. He could, with a little gentleness and a little calloused resolve, reach backward and forward in the same breath and set down a stone where someone was going to step. He had done it once. He had brought the smell of pine and snow to a square full of heat and human fear. He had put the word mercy into the mind of a boy who had never meant the word, and the boy had spat it out as if it were bitter and looked around for something sweeter to say, and then had thrown up his hands in a fit and said something else, something worse. He had watched the way that worse thing had been swallowed up, not because the boy's heart had changed, but because too many men near him had already decided to be cowards or to be brave, and that choice made the hinge on which a life turned. He did not speak of it. He would never speak of it. It lived in him the way iron sometimes lived in trees when a blade had been buried in a sapling and the sapling had grown around it. It made the grain of his wood strange in places. It sang when the wind came from the east. "You're unhappy," Ned said suddenly, his attention flicking up from the letter. "Or you're thinking about a quarrel." "I'm thinking about the way water forgets no stone," Bran said. He folded his arms and leaned on the table's edge. "I'm thinking about a boy I once was who wanted to put his hands on everything. I'm thinking about what makes men what they are." Ned looked down at his own hands, palm up. They were nicked and the skin lay tight over the bones. "Work," he said. "And the stories they tell about their work. And the women who remind them to wash." Catelyn made a noise at him that could have been disapproval if you did not know the line of her mouth so well. "Work," she agreed, which in her voice meant more than the word. Sansa writes that the Vale women have started hanging their flasks of spring water in the shade in nets so that their sisters can drink without being seen eating salt. It's a small thing, Bran, but now every time I see a net, I think of a woman somewhere else being a little kinder to her body. That feels like a thing the world should remember, however it wants to do it. A bell rang in the yard, the clear, bright one they'd hung near the gatehouse to mark the approach of a party in friendly colors. There was the scramble of feet, the release of breath a keep took when the day's first arrival was expected and not troubled. Catelyn stood swiftly enough that the sandhorn tipped and spilled a little stream over her skirt. She laughed and left it and went for the stairs at a speed that would have made a younger man hurry to catch her arm. "Ned," she called, and there was the girl in her voice who had asked him to run with her without caring what the lords would say. "Come and see our daughter." They went down. The main keep took in the noise and let it out softened and warm. A groom came running around a pillar with a bit of straw in his hair and stopped dead at sight of his lord in his path. Ned sidestepped him without making him feel the size of the rank he'd nearly collided with. The outer door opened on the pale day and Sansa stepped in with the breeze like a young woman who had learned to turn herself carefully so as not to tear. She had her mother's hair with a little more copper in it. Her face had changed in subtle ways that made sense only if you'd been looking at it every day for every year. She moved lightly, but there was weight in it. She had brought the sea back with her. It glittered in her eye when she looked at the windows, in the cut of her traveling coat, in the tidy way she had made her maid tie up her neck scarf. Behind her came 2 men and a woman in Gulltown colors, and behind them came a boy with a bundle and eyes that had never seen snow lie a month at a time. He looked as if he were keeping a tally of how many new things he had to learn in a single day. "Father," Sansa said, something like holiness in the relief on her face, and curtsied as if there were 100 eyes. though her mother was already across the hall with her hands on Sansa's arms and her mouth on her cheek. "Mother," she said after, and then, lifting her face over their shoulders. "Where is he? Where?" Bran stepped forward and did not come too near, because Sansa could not bear to have her hair pulled awry when she had not had a chance to remove her hat. She kissed him anyway, on the forehead like an old habit she had not forgotten, and he smelled salt in her braid. "You've grown wrong and right," she murmured to him so low only he would hear. "You look like a story I only half believe. And you," he said, "look like a person who has made friends with her ledger." She laughed, bright and full of a sound that belonged in this hall. Arya barreled in a second later and hit Sansa side on like a pup, so that the proper people stepped back at once and the proper things stayed on their hooks, and Sansa made a sound that was half protest and half pure girl, and they were together, the pair of them, tumbled together by time and distance and the way belonging always produces a sort of clumsy avalanche when it finds itself. "The wind here tastes like iron," Sansa said at last, pulling back and holding Arya by the shoulders. "And everyone looks like themselves. You've learned to look like 3 different people when you want," Arya replied tartly, though she flushed with pleasure at the sight of her sister's face. "You wrote me you'd bring me something." She did not care if it was a dress. Sansa turned and gestured, and the boy with the bundle stepped forward. He had a careful farmer's face. He untied the cords and unrolled it, and there, nested in old sacking as if it were nothing, lay a mask made of leather and lacquer stitched with wire in the way of the bravusi. It would sit over the top of the face and hold itself there, obscuring the brow and nose but leaving the mouth free. It was shaped like a falcon's beak. The leather had been dyed a deep matte so as not to catch light. "It was meant for a dancer in the Harbor Theater," Sansa said, her voice soft. "He traded it to me for a promise that if he ever came north and asked for work unloading salt, I'd give him a day's wage and a cup of warm wine. He wanted to see a mask I'd never seen," she added, and smiled at Bran because that was the kind of bargain that made him like her best. "It's ugly," Arya said with fervor, and then took it and turned it over in her hands and found it good. "Sansa," Catelyn said quietly, her fingers lingering a moment on the back of her daughter's gloved hand, "your brothers are well." "I can see," Sansa said, the words edged with gratitude so thick it had weight. She looked over their heads as she had when she was small, her eyes sweeping the galleries as if someone might appear there who had not. "Is there soup? I've been on the road 3 days enough to count for 5. "There's always soup," Ned said, and it felt like a benediction. By the time the bowls were set out, the Gulltown men had shaken off their travel and were ready to be pleased. The one with the sharper jaw, whose head smelled just a little of salt as Arya had said, spoke with Rickor and Clay Serwyn at once, like a man who could balance 3 coins on his fingers as he twirled them. He had a way of making a room seem full of good ideas that he himself had thought of first. Sansa nudged her father's ankle under the table, a small reminder not to trust the way a smooth stone looks in a stream. It sits on snakes often enough. Ned nudged her back as if to say he had stepped on enough stones and enough snakes in his time to know the difference when it mattered. If there was rule in the realm now, after all the scouring and burning and salt pouring, it was the kind of rule that came like this. In a hall with people you knew and some you didn't, with soup and candles and wool that had been mended in 3 places, with letters written across distance by hands that had learned to steady themselves in wind and between bumps in the road. It was not a crown. Men still said king. They said it because their fathers had said it and because the idea of a single throat to blame comforted them. But governance wore a plainer face and went to bed with dirt at the rim of its nails. Eddard Stark had sat a while in a chair in a red keep far to the south and had felt that chair eat away at his patience like salt. He had left it to good men who had learned to be better by practice, and sometimes to men who had learned to be different because the alternative was having nothing to do with themselves and finding that worse. The Hall of the Hand in King's Landing kept lights late now, and the men who sat there no longer imagined that every plan must pass through them like thread through a needle. The word they used when they were feeling like men more than boys was steward, and it tasted like bread. So the Starks ruled the realm in a way that left room in men's mouths for bread and for laughter, and it was called peace because there were long stretches of day when no rider came with his horse blown and no one counted the dead that dawn had knocked down as if they were wheat. And yet all peace was earned and kept, as Ned had said, one ember at a time. In the afternoon, Bran walked down to the kennels where one of the bitches was heavy with her first litter. The kennel master was a gentle man with hands like a carpenter's and eyes that missed nothing. He nodded to Bran and held up 2 fingers and then 3 and then 1, a signal they'd worked out between them for how many pups the bitch would whelp if she had any say. Bran knelt in the straw and put his palm on the bitch's flank. She puffed, tongue lolling. He felt the small series of thumps like a boy thumping a table to show the music suited him. The bitch turned her head and licked his hand twice solemnly, accepting his inspection as a due. Her owner, a lean man who trapped stoats, had come 3 times a day for a week to ask if everything would be well in the whelping, and each time the kennel master had said, "My lord here knows dogs better than I do," and each time Bran had said nothing he didn't mean until the man breathed easier. It was a small thing to take a worry from someone's pocket for a while and let him walk lighter. Sansa came to the door and watched him without interrupting. "Do you mean to keep one?" she asked when he rose. "We will pretend not to until it's too late," he said. "Else the kennel master will say we spoil our own, and we will have to stand at the next feast and be properly scolded in front of everyone." "Ugh," Sansa said with feeling. "What a bore that would be. Imagine all those men with their good sense falling out of their pockets as your pup stares up at them and whines a single time." "You count people very well now," Bran observed. "It used to make you tired. Now it makes you better." Sansa looked down at her gloves. "Counting makes the counting better," she said in the quiet, honest voice she kept for him and their parents and Arya. "It's tedious sometimes. It's also the thing that keeps wheat from rotting on a quay and keeps a lamp burning a night longer and gets a mother a blanket before her child gets a cough there's no need for. Maybe it's only tedious if you want someone else to do it." He nodded and liked her then more than he had the first time he saw the way she taught herself to carry a goblet without spilling when she was 12. She kinked an eyebrow at him, half challenge. "Are you hungry for the other kind of tedious?" she asked. "The kind where Robb speaks and men say aye and no in turn until the aye and no weigh the same and nothing can be done? I am hungry for oatcakes and bacon," he said. "But I will pretend to be hungry for aye and no." She smiled, satisfied. "It has to be done, Bran. And you might as well hear Lord Tallheart talk about the advantage of building a stone quay at Longsister now. For if you don't, he'll corner you later in the yard and do it while your ear is cold, and I won't have that." The afternoon council gathered in the small hall off the great one where the light fell flat and kind and made everyone look a little better than they were. Robb had gone broader in the chest and his beard had filled in, and then he had taken a knife to his hair with his own hand one bleak evening because he said he was tired of tugging at it when he thought. He wore a tunic with a repaired seam. The woman sitting to his right was from the Riverlands and had a smile like a well-kept lane. They loved each other in the way people did when they had learned to get by and then had learned that getting by together was a sort of pleasure. She had brought a son into the world who slept as if he meant it and a daughter who had eyes like her grandfather's when he was thinking about the price of barley. They were not there now, but their absence had weight in the room because the world was being arranged with them in mind. "Lord Tallheart," Robb said with patience that had been taught by long practice, "will begin, and my sister will have leave to speak second, for she has just ridden from a place where men have built such quays and have learned afterward what it cost them." Torrin Karstark, his hair going white at the temples, leaned an elbow on the table and told a story about stones and storms and a man who had tried to cheat both and had been taught a salty lesson. "Tyrion Lannister, in good Northern, will cut cunningly to allow him warmth without weight. Wagged his cup at the point where jokes would let the lesson in. He had become addict to usefulness because mirth alone had bored him and cruelty was a wine that had soured his stomach permanent. He was an envoy of a kind, but he had also become something harder to name. The sort of man who attends to the hinge of a door so it won't shriek every time someone walks through a room, and then takes pleasure in the silence. Asha of the Isles, she did not always allow men to call her lady, sat with her boots muddy and her eyes bright and said, "You can build your quay, but you must reckon upon crows. You cannot throw a handful of grain at a story about a quay and expect men to keep their hands out of it. Put it in the contract, the part about what happens to fingers that try to take what isn't theirs, and make it so the punishment is boring. If you are amusing with your punishments, Men will risk them for the story they'll get to tell in the alehouse. There were murmurs. Asha grinned. She had discovered that bored men do the most work in the least time if they are paid at the end and taken for granted in between. She kept her salt for her own stories and gave the North her pragmatism with a generosity that surprised her, and which she would have stabbed a man for remarking upon. Sansa spoke, and the room listened in the kind of way they had learned to listen to her. "You can count the stones twice," she said. "You can weigh them once and measure them once. You can add the cost of a bent back and a wet foot, and still the storms will have their way. It is better to build the quay once and well and then not speak of it again. Let the laborers keep a ledger of salt meat and soap and drink, and have a man whose single work is to look each man in the face at the end of a day and say, 'You have what you said you needed.' The work will do itself then. And men will not take the stones home because they are too tired and have nothing to build with them for a week but foolishness. We will send down ropes. Good ones. Not the ropes the merchants want to be rid of." Robb looked at her and looked at the room and nodded. "We will build it once," he said. And well, he had learned to like simplicity the way a man learns to like a chair that doesn't creak when he's tired. Theon came late, breath warm from a run, hair damp from a hastily dunked head. He slid into a place near Torrin and whispered something that made the older man's mouth go wry. He paid attention in the way of a man who knows he has broken the same thing twice and doesn't want to a third time. When the meeting broke up, he stood behind Bran and said very quietly, as if the admission itself should not be made to stand in the cold, "I dream sometimes I've done things I haven't. Terrible things. With my teeth. Then I wake and I can't keep my hands from shaking because I haven't done them, and I'm still afraid of myself. Do you ever dream you're someone you're not?" Bran turned and looked at him a long moment and saw the boy who had come to Winterfell with a Braavosi knife and a head full of swagger, and the man who had learned the value of solemnity, and the friend who came and sat in the Hall of Knights and let his own laughter be quiet so another could sleep. "I dream I am a crow," Bran said evenly, "and a tree, and a set of hands that are not mine. And once I dreamed I was the bell of a sept, and the sound I made the skin on my arms pill. It is not the worst thing to wake and find your own hands where you left them." Theon nodded, not ashamed of the relief. "I like soup," he said. "Then you will get your share," Bran said. "And you will not spill it in my lap," he added, and Theon, who had twice done so, grinned and put a hand briefly on Bran's shoulder as if to anchor them both. Night fell in the careful way it did in Winterfell, the gloaming moving like a thick animal through the yards, men shortening their strides and then lengthening them again as lamps were lit and distances were kept without thinking. Bran ate with his family at a long table where the bread passed easily and no voice had to be raised for a point to settle. There were 2 fiddlers, and one's E-string broke, and he swore in the soft, shocked guilt of a craftsman who had not done something wrong but had been near to something that broke. Arya got up and danced for a moment with Sansa's Gulltown man and made him look less pretty and more like a person. After, family gathered in the solar with cups and plates and the sort of aimless talk that cleans a day out of the corners of the mind. Catelyn asked after a shepherd woman who had given birth too far from warmth. Sansa nodded and said the child's head had been turned and a midwife with hands like trout had coaxed it into the world anyway, and the baby had cried like a lord demanding better blankets. Robb told a story about a man from the mountain clans who had come down with a bag of dried mushrooms and a single gold button to pay for his lodging, and how he had told Robb, in all sincerity, that he had found the god of rocks in a creek bed and had brought him up to show the girls in the kitchen. Ned told no stories and smiled in a corner and thought in a way that made his face tender. Bran listened to the roots, which under even a hall like this had grown thin and sly and had learned to drink what they could. He felt the old tree around which the keep had been first built hum a little as the fiddle tune found a chord that suited it. When the household began to thin, he excused himself and walked out into the yard where the stars were like frost thrown against the dark. His breath made small ghosts. Somewhere a dog coughed and then settled. He walked the perimeter as he had when he was a boy, his steps making a pattern he did not have to think about to make. He put his hand against the stones in the places where they remembered fire. He closed his eyes and let the pulse of Winterfell move through him like blood. Beyond the far wall, beyond the watchtower's old crack and the newer patched mortar, beyond the smell of the pig pens and the river, The forest had listened all that day to its own business. The wind had told it one thing and the cold had told it another, and both were true. An owl turned its head and saw what it could see. A fox laid down in a hollow and became a part of it without making a fuss. A man walked under the trees and believed he was alone. Bran knew he would go there again. He knew he would not be alone. He had seen, in the glass that was sometimes in his mind where memories rose, a piece of the future like an old coin under silt. It was nothing dramatic. A set of antlers left tangled in brambles, a white shard of skull glinting, a heel mark that did not quite belong to the winter shoes of any villager, because it was smooth at the toe as if the man who wore it had not walked far in winter before. The memory belonged to the roots. He could have walked away from it and done nothing. Peace, he had discovered, was made up of 1,000 moments when a man or woman walked away and did nothing. It was also made up of the moments when they did something very small and did it without telling anyone they had. It did not need a link of a chain for every action, nor a bell for every thought. Stillness itself was a kind of action. But learned stillness had a different flavor than cowardice, and he now knew the taste. He went back toward the godswood. The taste of pine was very faint on the air. It hurt and comforted at the same time. He found the place where the roots lay shallow, and he sat again. Winterfell settled around him with that small creak a house makes when it acknowledges and forgives another day's trespass. He let the trees hum enter him through the back of his head. He laid out his mind like a pair of hands palm up. He was careful. He fell inward and downward not as a man falls but as water does, making no splash. He saw the river of time as he always did when he chose to look. A braid of many threads that lay on top of each other, that sometimes crisscrossed and sometimes ran parallel without ever meeting. They were not separate rivers, he knew, any more than a braid is separate hairs. They were different ways the same water had learned to run. He could put a hand into one and draw it out wet with another. He could, if he had to, press a small stick into the bank to make a moment's eddy. He had done so. He had thought it would be enough and that the water would forget the shape of him after it had rushed past. He had been wrong about that, but he had not been wrong to do it. The square had been a furnace. The ragged sound of the crowd had turned his bones to hollow reeds. The headsman had held his sword as if it were a thing that had crawled into his hand and bit him. A boy's mouth had been wet and slack with cruelty he called justice because he had no language for what else he was made of. The wind had been wrong and he had made it right. He had sent in a bird. He had put fear into the eyes of a man whose job it was to be unmoved, and the man, being given the small mercy of fear, had moved at the wrong moment, and a blade had come down and found straw instead of flesh because the wrong man had stepped where he had been told to stand. That was how it had happened in the end. Not because the boy had become a good boy, not because the man had become brave, but because time had decided to trip over its own feet in that one place where there had once been no room for tripping. He had learned then that men who live because someone else thinks to take a breath at the right time have a way of remembering that breath their whole lives. He rose later than he had meant to. The night had drawn in around him and then thinned. He stood with the taste of water in his mouth and found Arya sitting cross-legged on the stone, her face turned upward like a cup. "I thought you were the heart tree," she said in a conversational tone. "And then I saw your foot and recognized your stupid boot. And yet you did not call out," he observed. "If you were the tree, you would have been offended. And if you were you might have been somewhere between sleep and dream, and you would have come out of it angry if I'd grabbed your ankle," Arya said. She leaned back and put her palms flat. "I'm going to ride south with the men taking the messages to White Harbor," she said without preamble. "Rob knows, and Mother knows, and Father knows. I'd like you to know because you will know when I do it anyway." "Do you want me to talk you out of it?" Bran asked. "No," she said, "but I want you to say something wise, or something foolish. I'd like to carry something I can take out on the road and turn in my hand and not find too smooth too quickly." He thought. "You've always liked to fight your wars on roads," he said at last. "A road is an argument between places. It says they belong to one another even when they don't want to. When you ride one, you're a sentence that wants to decide what sort of punctuation it carries. You can be a comma if you like, a pause and a breath, an N and, Or you can be a full stop. Or you can be a question. A question, she said, satisfied. Everything gets stiff if you never ask why. She stood and punched his arm, a softness in her gone that had not been a good softness to begin with. Keep Sansa from making men too pleased with themselves, she added. Keep Robb honest when he wants to be good. Keep Mother from putting all the blankets on people who say they're cold and none on herself. And keep Father laughing when you can, because it's like making a laugh out of flint. He nodded. And you, he said, keep your head attached to your neck. I'm fond of both together. She grinned and walked away into the thinning night, her back straight and her hands loose. He watched her until she was under the arch and gone, and the gods would breathe again. He went out the west wall later and into the trees. The forest had the first frost of morning in it. The bracken was crisp at the edges, and when he pushed aside a branch, fine ice fell like glass dust. He found the bramble and the antlers, a crown wrecked into thorns. He picked up the white shard of bone and held it in his palm. It held cold badly, as if it wanted to be warm. The heel mark was where he had seen it, in the wet of a place that did not dry exactly like the places around it. He knelt and put 2 fingers into it and felt the memory of the man who had taken that step. A man with hunger in him and pride and the unsteady hope of someone who had run away from a promise and thought he might make one of his own that would fit him better. Bran looked up. You can come out, he said. I won't call the dogs. If I wanted the dogs, you wouldn't hear them before you saw them, and that would be unkind. The trees made no declaration. The man came out anyway, slow and upright, his hands open. He had a beard like a broom, and his boots were good ones that had once belonged to someone who didn't know what a winter requires from leather. He watched Bran's face like a man watching weather. I ran, he said conversationally. It was a foolish thing. I'm not good at running. I've been back and forth and thought I would go on and never find that I got anywhere. Then, he added, a kind of astonishment softening his rough voice, I turned and the place I'd been keeping away from had followed me and was right there. You came to it, Bran said, which is different. The man stood a moment with his hands up. He had the look, once you saw it, of a man who had slept with his head on a stone more often than was good. Your Lord Father, he said, once took me out of a cell and gave me to the wall. I went. I didn't like it. I liked the cold less than other men, which is not wise in a man who goes north. I left. I've been leaving ever since. I thought if I came back and put my hands where your Lord Father could see them, he might not cut them off. Bran let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He stood and brushed his palms on his breeches. He won't, he said. He will give you something to do, and he will be impatient if you do it badly, and he will be patient if he can see you are learning. You will not like him. You will respect him so much you'll think your bones might crack, which is another way of liking someone. The man swallowed. He looked around. You speak for him? He asked, not mocking. I speak because no one else is here yet, Bran said, and because I know how this will go. Come down to Winterfell and say your name and say that you've been running and you're tired of your own feet. If you are lying, you will end up with your cheek in the dirt. If you are telling the truth, you will end up with a blanket in a warm room and a spade in your hand. You will have to get up early, and you will not have the way with words you think you do. Try not to talk as if words will get you out of work. Father knows how to shovel words into the corner like snow. The man let out a short, ugly laugh, turned into a cough. I can dig, he said. I just can't seem to stop digging when I ought to. Bran nodded. Come, he said, and turned toward Winterfell and did not look back to see if the man followed. He knew the sound of the footsteps that came after. They were the steps of a man who had once learned to march and had walked alone long enough to forget that a march keeps time so that the men don't. Back in the yard, men were saddling horses, and someone was swearing in the open, the way he would not have dared 5 years ago. The swearing stopped as Bran walked by. He passed the man into the keeping of a steward who had the knack for sorting cooper from thief without dishonoring either. He went to find his father and tell him there was a new spade to set to work. Ned listened and took it in as part of a day and said only, he will try to leave again. He will, Bran said. But he will find that his feet go in place now, not crosswise. You've become a man who tells me things I know already, Ned said with grave enjoyment. I am proud to be your father. Bran went still. Then he smiled with the awkwardness he could never quite prevent when his father said something like that. He carried it with him into the rest of the day. News came up the road and down the river in their steady ways. A cart from Barrowton bearing rough wool that a clever weaver would make into more than the sum of its hills winds. A woman from the rills with a petition for a bridge repair and a bread in her basket that she broke in half precisely and gave to 2 different guards without looking up to see if they were surprised by it. A raven with a ribbon tied above its leg to mark haste, its feathers standing each side of its neck like hackles because it had been cooped too long in a hand too small. It brought a letter from the wall with Jon's steady hand, and when Bran cracked the seal, the smell of the cold came with it as if the paper had remembered frost and carried it hidden in its fibers. Brother, the letter said in the stiffened hand of a boy who had become a man while trying to keep his handwriting neat. There are tracks we don't know. Not man, not beast. The old bear would have called them old news. The men under me call them the news that matters. It is not the shapes that frighten me so much as their habits. They walk where we don't and fail to walk where we do. If this is peace, it is the peace a hunter gives his prey by not looking at it just yet. Send us rope and lamps and oil. Send us news of how far a word will carry from a man standing on a hill. Send Sansa a list of the names of those who have wives in the south, so that she can send them something that tastes like home. Tell father I will write to him about discipline. And tell mother that we have learned to wear 2 pairs of socks and that we are grateful for an old woman with a mouth like a knife who is teaching boys how to make thread behave in their hands. Tell Arya I'm not impressed by her choice of mask, but I will be if she brings it here and lets the boys learn what it feels like to be watched by a bird. Tell Theon that I liked his last joke and that if he comes north he will have to bring more than a smile. Tell the tree I know its name and I will not put it in a letter. Bran read the letter twice and then a 3rd time, breathing as if it were his own work he was preparing to cut. He took it to Ned and let him read. Ned stood with the paper in his hand and felt the slight, deliberate weight of each word, and the way Jon had learned to let words carry weight like a man shares the weight of a log with his brother. He said, "He holds them well," and he did not have to say the word men for Bran to know he meant it too. "We will send him rope," Sansa said, her fingers already counting, "and lamps, and a woman to teach the boys, and if she has a mouth like a knife, better." "What will he do with news of how far a word will carry?" Arya asked from the doorway where she had been listening without being seen. "Is he teaching them to shout?" "He is teaching them to whisper over distance," Bran said. He felt the shape of the idea in the roots and in the lay of the land. He is teaching the wall to be a mouth that speaks along itself, and for parts of it to hear when other parts call out. He wants to know if a man can stand on a hill and speak and have another man half a mile away say aye and go and do what needs doing. "And can he?" Theon asked. "Yes," Bran said quietly. "If the wind is right. If the men have practiced when there is no need so that they know what to do when there is. If a boy sits in a god's wood far away and pushes the sound a little, so the hill gets to be a bit taller." Ned's eyes flicked to him. He did not say yes and he did not say no. He said, "Send rope and lamps and a woman with a mouth like a knife." 2 nights later they held a small feast because it was early winter and because the day had been long and good and because in a long peace you celebrate the makeshift occasions. Good lambing, a new song learned, a visiting sister. The hall took several breaths of heat as men came in stamping and women put off their shawls and laughter settled like dust motes in light. The fiddlers had new strings. A boy from White Harbor brought a drum he had made by stretching hide over a keg head. Its sound, when he thumped it, was like a heart, and it pulled the room into its rhythm until the room was moving as one. The kind of moving that made men with grievances forget them for an hour and women with too much on their minds set some of it down. Bran ate and drank and spoke in turn. He watched his parents watch their children and saw the way a deep sense of something right had laid itself over them like a quilt. He listened to the roots, and they hummed contentment and the murmur of a lesson learned. Do what you must and no more. He did not think of the square. He thought, instead, of rope and lamps and a hill and a boy at the top of it speaking a word and then listening for the echo. He thought of the way the wall learned to talk to itself. Later, alone, he went again to the godswood and put his back to the tree and closed his eyes and climbed down. He found himself walking not in the past but in one of the other braids, where men had died who had not died here, and wolves had starved that had grown fat here. He walked with his feet on the riverbed and felt the way the stones sat. It was a habit he had allowed himself only rarely. The temptation of it was not the drama of seeing a man you loved alive where he was dead in your own world, or the small, sour delight of seeing an enemy brought low where once he had not been. It was, instead, the odd comfort of seeing that even where tragedy had rooted itself and grown a tree of a sort, the ground still knew itself. The frost still formed in the corners of the same leaves. The basin below the low step still collected rain the way it did here. Somewhere a woman laughed the same laugh because she had been born half a day later and her teeth were straight in either world. He walked and he kept his hands by his sides and he did not reach in. He had learned, after the square, to keep his fingers out of the water unless there was a hand reaching for him from it. He went to the step and looked at the puddle and saw, looking back up at him from that other place, the shape of his father's face as it had been when years had been taken from it. He put his palm flat against the skin of the world and closed his eyes. The roots touched his mind the way a dog touches your knee to remind you it is there. He came back to his own godswood and opened his eyes and let out a breath. Behind him, the heart tree's face seemed, in the moonlight, to shift. It did not. A leaf fell and landed on his shoulder. He lifted it and turned it and then put it between two pages of the book of the day and closed the book and put it carefully away. Far to the north, a boy stood on a low hill and said a word. Another boy, far enough off to be his own man, said aye and moved. Lamps were lit in a line along a wall of ice, one after another, because someone had thought to count them, and then to think about what it meant to know how many lights were shining. Rope was coiled and oiled and ready. A woman taught a boy to stitch a torn mitten while telling him he'd be no goods to anyone if his fingers dropped off his hand, and he believed her because her mouth had the shape of the knives that cut bread and meat, and because the room had a smell like good broth and ambition. In Winterfell, a pup was born feet first, and the kennel master, with his carpenter's hands, turned it gently in the canal and breathed a curse and then a prayer and then a thank you to no one in particular, because that was the shape relief took in him. Sansa slept and dreamed her ledger arranged itself into a song that people danced to, and woke laughing. Arya at that moment was sleeping under a wagon near the white knife with her mask under her head. She had put it there because she liked the smell of the leather and because it would have been a failure of vigilance to leave it anywhere else. Theon came awake from a dream of a man nailed to a cross and sat and breathed and found he could breathe without counting. Robb got up to piss and stood in the yard feeling how the cold kept a man honest with himself. Catelyn woke to Ned's hand on her hip and lay still and thought that the day had been kind and the next would be kind in a different key. Bran did not sleep at first. He sat with his back against the tree and listened. The roots told him small stories. A mole had a favorite tunnel, and a worm had found a fruit too soon and a bird had pecked at it and made a small sweet mess. The leaves sang the little tune leaves always sing at that time of night. He counted the minutes with no need for numbers. When he slept, he dreamed not of a square or a blade or a boy's slack mouth. He dreamed of the wall being a mouth and a throat and a chest that could take in air and push out sound. He dreamed of a word traveling along its length faster than a horse could run and a man turning because he knew to turn. The roots hummed approval. The heart tree wept its slow red tears for those it had lost and those that would be lost and kept on breathing. Morning would come with all its ordinary work. It would bring Sansa's second cup of tea and a letter from a woman in the Vale with a question about a tapestry that could double as a blanket in a pinch. It would bring Robb's patient ear for a man who wanted to argue about the way sheep strayed when the wind was wrong. It would bring Arya's first good view of the river ice and her exasperated delight in the way it had Aelar. Edie learned to trick men who thought it looked solid. It would bring Theon's vow to tell a joke to a boy in the stables who had been seeing ghosts in his own hands. It would bring a visit to the widow to ask, not after her stew, but after her chest and her stool, because that was how you kept peace. You asked after the thing that would break first if it were asked to bear too much weight. Morning would come, and between the last breath of night and the first clear air of day, Bran set one small stone into the path of the river, not to change its course, but to keep it from wearing away the bank at a point he knew would not bear it. Then he stood and went in, and Winterfell woke, and the realm they had made to hold more kindness than it had known in many a year did the simplest thing a made thing can do. It continued. Morning put its hands on the stones as if checking for fever. The thin ice on the fountain cracked and sank without fuss. Steam went up from the kitchen mouth in a steady column that said the fire had been coaxed back into good humor. The horses stamped, one after another, as if a single mind had told them to remember their legs. Bran woke with the faint taste of sap on his tongue and washed at a basin that had held sunlight last afternoon and remembered it helpfully now. Catelyn's shawl was on the settle where she had thrown it in the night. He folded it and put it over its peg, a little ritual he liked because it made the room look like a room the people in it deserved. Ned was already up, of course. He came in with cold on his beard and the look of a man who had been assured, by his own eyes, that nothing unexpected had tried to walk into his keep while he slept. He ruffled Bran's hair as if Bran were not taller than the old seasons kept him. They ate oatcakes and bacon and eggs that had come with a small lecture about the hen that laid them and her opinion of the weather. Hobb delivered the lecture and the eggs with the same seriousness. "We should send the rope today," Sansa said, finding her place at the table between her parents with the ease of someone who had learned to sit where she wanted to work as much as where she wanted to be loved. She had a ledger open with a smear of sausage fat on one corner where she'd pointed at two zealously. "By the time the river freezes, we'd rather not be loading boats. Hallis will take it," Ned said. "He's fussy enough to count the coils twice, and not so fussy he'll dress the counting in words. He has the knack of putting work in a man's hands instead of the idea of work in his head." Sansa marked Hallis with a curl of ink that would tell her later he had been thought of warmly. "And the woman for the gloves?" she asked without looking up, flipping a page and squinting as if she could will the numbers to come into better order. "If the wall is going to learn to speak, it should do it with warm hands." "Barbri's sister," Catelyn said, pouring tea as if it conferred sense. "She has a mouth like a knife and a laugh like a door swinging on well-oiled hinges. She made me a mitten last winter that didn't find an excuse to fall off my hand each time I carried a basket." "Send her," Ned said. "If she won't go, send the mitten and her temper, and the boys will learn to do it for fear of her appearing behind them when they drop a stitch." Arya ate standing up. She did not like the chairs in the morning. They made her legs want to run because they did not. She had a pack over her shoulder and her mask looped over her belt like a promise she hadn't decided to keep. "Hallis leaves by midday," she said, serious for once. "If I ride with him, I can match my pace to his until he remembers I'm not a parcel he can tie to a saddle. Then we'll see how far we get today with the light as it is. The river will keep us honest." Catelyn lifted her eyes and let them rest a long moment on her daughter's face. It was not permission she gave, Arya had permission already, but a benediction. "You will sleep under something that has been mended twice," she said, the cadence of superstition under the common sense. "And you will not shame a baker by turning your nose up at the crust." "I will not," Arya said obediently. She looked at Sansa. "You'll write to me and tell me if the quarrel about the quay becomes a full hymn with a chorus, won't you? I want to know how many men think the sea owes them a favor." Sansa's mouth curled as if she'd bitten something she liked. "I'll write you the names of all the men who quote the tide at me as if they invented it," she said. "And I'll tell you which one I made carry stones for an hour so he could feel their opinions in his forearms. You'll be proud of me if I manage not to draw blood with a pen." Arya leaned in and bumped Sansa's shoulder with her own. "I already am," she said, brusque with sincerity, and then she made a face to scuff the feeling away and turned to Bran. "Bring me back a story," Bran told her quietly. "Not the kind you can tell in a breath. One that needs to sit by the fire and take its boots off." Arya nodded, for once solemn. "I'll bring you one with mud on it," she promised. They went out together to the yard to see Hallis's men load the coils of rope, the lanterns wrapped in oiled leather with straw tucked around them to keep the glass from breaking. Hallis Mullen counted underneath his breath, tapping his knuckle against the side of a crate as he did, as if to teach the wood to remember the number. He looked up only when Arya's shadow fell over his ledger. "You'll be thinking you're going with me," he said. His tone resigned in the way of a man who has lost the argument in advance and likes the loser well enough. "I'll be riding along until the road decides whether it likes me," she said. "If it doesn't, I'll turn toward the river and follow it and listen to the ice. It's not personal." "Everything's personal to the river," Hallis said and spat to one side. "Your father said I was to trust you as far as I could throw you. So climb up and we'll see how far that is." "Careful with that coil," Sansa called to a boy whose eagerness had put him one step ahead of his body. "It's more valuable than your shoulders. And you know, not like that, like you mean it to hang straight when it's lit." Tyrion watched from a bench with a mug of small beer cupped between his hands, his eyes bright in the cold. He had a knack for finding places out of wind where men might pass by and say things they didn't mean to say in front of him. He took it as a personal failing that men liked themselves when they liked him. He didn't trust anyone who collected fondness for its own sake. But he had learned that fondness oils the hinge of a door better than contempt, and he preferred quiet doors. "Arya," he said as she passed, his mouth quirking, "if you should come upon a crow with a complaint, tell him I run a court for such things every third Thursday, and he can come and tell me about the injustice of winter to his own particular feathers. I will ask him sternly whether he paid his taxes." "I'll bring you one if he's interesting," Arya said. "Not if he tells me a long story about how he never meant to be black." "Spare me the reformed," Tyrion agreed gravely. He and Arya liked each other because the line between their mockery and their affection was draw with chalk they both could smudge whenever they wished. Theon came at a trot with a roll of oiled cloth under his arm. He looked cleaner than usual and more rumpled, a combination produced by rising earlier than he liked to do something useful and not quite knowing how to be praised for it. "Gifts for the boys," he told Hallis, jerking his chin at the roll. "Whistles, bone, loud as virtue." Hallis grunted approval. "We'll teach them to use them when they mean it," he said. "Not when they're telling us they've dropped a glove." Theon glanced at Arya. "If you see an honest man on the road, keep him that way," he said with an attempt at lightness, and then softer. "And if you see a man you think would be tempted to break, give him something to hold. It helps." "Like a rope," Arya said. "Or a joke," Theon said, and surprised himself saying it. They mounted. Hallis had chosen a gelding with a sensible head and a tail like old rope. Arya's mare had a temper she would have denied sharing. She patted the leather around her mask and checked her girths twice, though she had checked them once already. Ned put his hand on her boot. "If the road asks a question you don't like," he said in the voice that had told her bedtime stories about wolves who kept promises, "you can refuse to answer without being rude." She nodded because it wasn't a lesson about roads anymore. She leaned down and pressed her face to her father's hair as if to smell the winter on him deep, and when she sat straight again, she did it with a confidence that made him feel young and tired in the same breath. They rode out with the sound of steady hooves and a few cheers swallowed quickly by the cold. Sansa stood and watched until the last splash of mud was just another brown among browns. She blew into her cupped hands. "All right then," she said to no one in particular. "I will go and ask 3 men why they think a contract should include the right to pocket nails." "And I," Tyrion said, sliding off the bench with a small groan, "will go and ask a woman if she would like her turnips weighed with honesty or flattery. Either way, I will get scolded by a man who thinks he knows better than all of us." He looked pleased by the prospect. "Bran," he added, catching the boy's sleeve as if he'd thought of him by accident, though he never thought of anything so. "When you listen to the trees, do they ever complain about the crows?" "They complain about axes," Bran said, "and fire, and the way a man will piss against a trunk without thinking he's asking a favor." He saw the corner of Tyrion's mouth tuck in and knew he'd entertained him. He let the man have the small pleasure and went toward the quiet the gods would held like a coin under the tongue. There were petitions to hear that day in the small hall that had once been used for more splendid entertainments. Ned preferred its plainness. Men could not puff themselves up to their full stupidity in a low-ceilinged room that smelled of oiled wood and wool. They came in twos and ones and handed over their arguments as if they were bundles, and Ned untied them and took out the contents and laid them on the table and said, "Here is what one might do," until both men recognized themselves again. A shepherd from the hills and a weaver argued about water rights because the stream that had always run as if it were proud had decided on a new way down a slope after last year's rains. And a little fence had been made inadequate by an act of God too small to be called an act of God. The shepherd said his ewes were creatures of habit and had not learned to be polite around the new banks. The weaver said the water that ran over the old where had never interfered with his mother's work, and that change had no right to come into a man's house and make him a liar. Ned listened and then asked them both, with that old patience that had taught men how to speak in his hearing, what they would like if the positions were reversed. They glowered and then, grudgingly, said sensible things. He ordered 2 boys with spare hands and shoulders to spend a day building a new weir, paying them with coin and with the small pride of being asked. He ordered the weaver to teach the shepherd's eldest girl to warp a loom for nothing more than the pleasure of feeling useful, and the shepherd to let the weaver's boy help with lambing when it came. Peace bestowed and demanded small joint labors like that, woven through a day like strong thread. A man with a cut on his face argued that another man's pig had rooted up his garden with the stubbornness only pigs and magistrates were blessed with. "I repaired your fence last spring with my own hands," the accused man said with injured feeling. "It held," the judge, who had repaired the fence in truth, put in, "until it didn't, and when it didn't neither of you came and told me, 'Go home. I'll send 2 of my boys to put in a post and we'll fine you the price of the post between you, and if the pig gets out again I'll eat it and that will be that.'" Tyrion sat at the back under the sill and offered commentary to no one in particular. "We ought to put up a sign," he said. "Bring us your tedious quarrels, and we will honor them with tedious solutions. Leave your appetite for drama at the gate. Or let Asha write the code," Sansa said, looking up from her notes with wicked primness. She would put the fine for stealing a nail at 1 day's work of the thumb that pinched it, and quartermasters hectoring at half a day standing by the storehouse listening to the quartermaster complain about damp. "She'd be right," Tyrion said. "An afternoon in her company can cure a man's taste for foolishness for a week." "I like her," Sansa admitted, and that admission was one of her small private pleasures. She liked being surprised by her own liking. "She treats me as if I were a fellow adult and not as if I were a girl. She expects me to know how much a barrel weighs. It is both flattering and instructive." When the petitions had been heard and the soup ladled and another kind of work began, Catelyn came to find Bran in the mews. He liked to watch the birds when they had eaten and were sleepy, their heads turned under their wings, their feet relaxed around the perch as if they had decided to forgive their own weight. "Howland Reed sent a man with a frog spear," she said without preface. "He came up through the lower gate and ate 2 bowls of porridge without letting the steam out of the second, and now he sits as if he is pleased to wait until your father has finished with his soup." Bran's heart made a small, ungoverned lurch. Howland Reed was a man whose shadow had been longer than his body in all the stories. Bran had learned to measure him by what he did not say to other men. "He will be where the trees are, then," Bran said, wiping a smudge from his thumb on the hem of his tunic. "And he will smell like wet grass, and a little like new iron." "He will smell like mud," Catelyn said drily, "because he crossed the river where the stones are more a suggestion than a promise, and his boots let their truth be told." She put her hand for a moment on Bran's cheek, as if the memory of a cave and a man with eyes shaped like a river had passed through her too. "Go then," she said. "He came to see you as much as your father." Reed was in the Godswood. He sat with his legs tucked under him the way a marshman sits to keep himself smaller to mosquitoes and larger to snakes. He had put his spear on the ground with the point aimed away from the tree. Bran liked him for that. He liked the lines on Howland's face, which had not learned to brag. They had learned to carry weather without complaint. "Little Lord," Howland said, which was a name like a memory in a mouth, "you have grown taller than the rushes, which you did warn me you intended to do." Bran sat opposite him and felt the roots between them like the cords of a net. "You have come up out of the green and brought it with you," he said. If I close my eyes, I can see the way the water looks on the fawn at dusk when the sky is a bruise and the eels think about their sins. Howland smiled as if a boy had proved he'd remembered a step in a dance. We pay for water, he said, and it pays us back. Men who fish for their lives know that bargain. Men who fish for leisure think the river owes them a favor. Only one will forgive the river when it takes a hook. Ned joined them with the careful step of a man who did not believe his feet should force the pond to move. "Reed," he said, and it was a greeting that held a handful of winters. "You've come because the wind said something you thought we'd better hear?" Reed made a small gesture with his hand that might have been agreement and might have been superstition. "A song," he said. "Not the words, but the way a song sounds when the words don't matter yet and your feet understand it anyway. There are paths in the neck that have begun to hum under a man's soles, and not in the way they hum when a boat has passed. It is a sound like breath, but not a thing that breathes." Bran let his eyes fall half shut. He could feel, if he leaned his attention like an ear toward that quarter, a kind of attention that was not a man's and not a beast's, and not altogether an ill will but not a friend's. "There are tracks by the wall that don't belong to things with simple hungers," he said. "John writes of them with care, as if he's been taught by someone who is sensible about tracks to be more afraid of regularity than heat." Howland nodded as if he had expected the boy to already have this piece of the world in hand. "I brought you a thing," he said, and reached into the pouch at his side. He brought out what looked like a reed, ordinary save that it had been cut and polished and bound with a thread of marsh silk that caught the light like standing water. "Hold it," he said, and handed it across the roots as if passing a cup over a sleeping child. Bran took it. It fit his hand the way a well-made tool fits the hand of a man who has earned the right to hold it. "What does it do?" he asked softly. "It hums when it's near a thing that wants to be a secret," Howland said. "Men think a secret is quiet. We, who live where the ground can swallow a man without comment, know that quiet is loud if you know where to listen. This will tell you if you are standing where something would rather you were not. It will not tell you what to do about it. That is not the work of a reed." Ned looked from the reed to Bran to the roots. "Is it your belief," he asked carefully, "that what hums wants to come south? Or only that it has happened to begin near men and so men will be involved, as we always are when we shouldn't be?" Howland's eyes were old in the way waters are old, which is not to say tired. "Men stack wood when they are cold," he said. "If the humming is a cold, men will answer it in their way. I came to you because you have learned to stack words and to stack quiet, and both of those are better than stacking wood where it doesn't belong. I do not say trouble has come. I say the marsh has learned a new verse to an old song. I would like you to hum along and tell me if we should ask for a different tune." Bran put the reed to the hollow of his throat and felt, not sound, but a kind of readiness. The tree behind him was generous with its shade. He thought of the wall being taught to speak and of a word running along it like a boy with a message and of lamps being lit not in panic but in preparedness. "We will listen," he said, which was both promise and acknowledgement of their limits. Howland stayed a day and a night, and in that time he told no story that did not include the price of the thing he was telling. He talked like a man who had been alone more than most men are, and who had learned the value of company by not always having it. He and Ned sat late, the silence between them thicker than talk, and when they did speak it was in the cadence of men who had learned the same lesson twice in different places and enjoyed discovering that more than they enjoyed being right. Caitlin brought Howland a shawl because he would not say he was cold, and he let her put it over his shoulders as if he had remembered how much he liked a woman's hand setting a weight there. In the kennel, the bitch whelped the pups with more dignity than was required of a dog. The breech-born pup took the teat as if he had invented the idea, and he gave a protesting bark at its smallness that made two men in the loft laugh until the hay told them to stop. Bran held him and wiped the mess from his nose and went to put him back and then didn't and put him under his own cloak for a moment to give him heat he did not need but which seemed to modify the day in his favor. The pup's body made a small hard curl against his belly. He put him down again and watched him fight a sister with twice his ambition. He made a note to come back at dusk and see if the fight had made him wiser or just more determined. Sansa spent the morning arranging for a wagon she had not realized she needed, and the afternoon convincing a mason that a stone disguised as a loaf of bread in a contract was still a stone. He left smelling of humility and brick dust and came back later with an apology for a wife who had had to wait to eat. Sansa accepted it as if it had been a coin that fit the slot of a machine and made the next thing go. She liked the engineer's feeling of that. It soothed the part of her that had once thought the world arranged itself around songs and then had learned it arranged itself around lists. She went down to the quay site the following day with Asha and a little retinue of men whose hands were clean only because the work had not yet begun. The stones looked unimpressed. The sea breathed as it always did, rough with confidence. "If you build it to please the eye," Asha told a lord with a head like a turnip, "we'll be fishing your stones out of the surf in a year and serving them to the gulls. Build it to please the sea. She's picky and she never says thank you, but when she likes a thing she leaves it be." The lord made a face as if to ask who had invited a woman to tell him the sea's mind. Sansa smiled the smile she had learned in Gulltown that meant a man could keep his pride as long as he didn't keep it on the page. "We'll please you both," she said. "And the man who has to carry the barrel, he gets a vote if only because he's the one who will curse us if we're wrong." She knelt and picked up a pebble and threw it into the shallows. "It is a good place to build a thing," she said. "It wants our stubbornness as much as our coin." Theon, knowing he had no talent for stones, moved among the men and put his hand on shoulders and said things in a voice that did not jingle with jokes unless a joke was what the moment required. He took aside a boy who'd looked at the sea like a girl he planned to cheat and told him a story about a man who had tried to cheat a girl who turned out to be his sister and how he had found a better plan when it turned out to also be more honest. The boy did not understand the parable, but he liked Theon's grin and decided not to be foolish for at least an afternoon. Robb stayed at Winterfell, grinding down a problem with a set jaw until it yielded. He had a way, when he was stumped, of going to the yard and chopping wood until someone told him he was wasting energy, and then he would go back to the table and speak reasonably to it, and the table would give up its answer because it knew it could not win by outlasting him. His lady came and set her hands on his shoulders and frowned at him when the knot between them tightened. "You are not a horse," she would tell him. "If you don't stop pulling this cart for a half hour and breathe, I'll ride another horse up beside you and tie your reins to mine, so you have to go walk slow." It was a marriage that had learned, by practice, that threats are best when lovingly delivered. Letters went out and letters came in. Clay Serwyn wrote from a village where two boys had learned to carve wood with more devotion than accuracy and wanted to show someone how a dog can be taught to sit. Sansa wrote back that she would pay them for 3 stools, one to sit upon, one to wobble upon and learn patience, and one to give away to a woman who had no stool and a bad back. Tyrion wrote south and received a reply folded in a way that said the man who had written it had been taught to fold a shirt with crisp corners. The reply was full of civility and caution and the kind of humor that grows in men who like to be liked but cannot quite tell the difference between liking and advantage. The Hall of the Hand kept long hours and fewer secrets than it used to. No one asked Ned to come down. It was not that he was not wanted. It was that people who thought they wanted him had learned to want themselves to be the kind of men who did not need him. It is a rare and excellent skill to make a man proud to be the one to take on your job. Eddard Stark had acquired it by being willing to let a thing be done by someone else if he judged the someone else would sleep better for it. By the 3rd day, Hallis had reached the last good tavern before White Harbor, and Arya had learned the names of 8 dogs and the price of hay in a place where the roof leaked in a way that had been tolerated so long it had turned into a family member. She slept under the wagon, as she had said she would, and woke without any of the dramatics she used to attach to leaving beds to make beds feel unappreciated. She drank thin beer and tried not to talk to every child between Winterfell and the sea. She failed and was only scolded twice by Hallis for giving away too many of her stories before she had a chance to live them. On the 4th morning, a man stepped into the road with a grin like a snare. He had 2 friends in the thicket each side. Arya knew because the birds had flown without quite the panic 3 men lifting bows ought to cause. Men did not smell brave to birds, but birds knew the difference between calm and the wrong kind of stillness. She nudged her mare with her knee. Hallis lifted his chin half an inch. "I see them and I won't be foolish. Good morning to you, bright travelers. the man in the road said with the practiced ease of a man who has learned his welcome in many places lies between his teeth and the place where he keeps his knife. This road used to be full of fellers with more swagger than sense. You'll be pleased to hear we chased them off and have taken stewardship of this stretch. We charge only a small toll for the service. Tolls come with gates, Hallis said mildly, and with records, and with a place where a man can come back with a complaint. You have a nice face. It would not look well as a gate. The man's grin did not shift. Beyond the next bend is a ditch, he said agreeably. I could charge you for the privilege of not having to pull your wheel out of it. I am generous enough to warn you in advance. If you dig the ditch and stand there like a fence post, you can make yourself a gate after a fashion, Hallis returned. But you have to decide to be yelled at by every man who passes. It wears the temper something awful. He reached into his coat and tossed something underhand, gentle as a man tossing an apple to a child. Here's your toll, he said. My rude gesture for turning good men into fences. You can buy yourself a chicken. The man, astonished, caught the thing. He stared at it. A whistle. Bone. Loud as virtue. Theon's gift. Ricocheting into another day's usefulness. What? The man said, disarmed. Do I want with a whistle? When you're ready to be useful, blow it, Arya said, her voice calm because she had decided calm made better stories. She touched the mask with 2 fingers and let it hang over her face where he could see it if he wished to and not if he didn't. And when you blow it, be prepared to tell me which fence you'd like to stand by while you learn how to fetch water for old women who can't walk through the mud themselves anymore. If you blow it twice, I'll expect you to tell me what you ate for supper last night and whether a bite of that would have tasted better if a child had had it. The man blinked. He looked at the whistle again. His friends in the thicket tried to hold their breath and found it an imperfect strategy. A woman's voice from behind the bracken said, in a tone that could have belonged to a wife or a cousin or a sister, or pity, take it. He took it. He stepped aside. He did not grin. He let them pass, and Hallis did not look back, because looking back can turn a man into a grudge when he is trying to be something else. Arya did not look back either and pretended for the sake of her own pride that it was because she could feel when a man had put his hand on his own neck and found his pulse, and she did not need to look and see to know that he had chosen to keep that pulse going until the next decision asked. White Harbor was all bustle and salt and the smell of stone being a little offended by constant damp. Men had learned to stack their houses against the weather as if they were arguing with a stubborn relative who would not change his mind, and the argument had taken on the tone of affection in self-defense. Manderley's banners hung where Asha always pretended not to see them, and then saw them with both eyes and made a sound under her breath that meant she would be pleasant when invited to be and not before. Hallis delivered his rope and his lamps and his woman with the knife mouth, who had come with her own bundle and an opinion about the way long benches should be placed for sewing circles. He drank a beer that thought too much of itself and sat by a fire that admitted it smelt like fish and didn't care. Arya went down to the docks and watched the gulls be themselves without embarrassment. She heard a piece of information without looking for it. A boy had fallen into the gap between quay and boat 3 days ago and come up laughing. It had not been funny. Another thing, a man with hands like paddles had held the boy's head a moment too long underwater while pretending to teach him a lesson that had nothing to do with swimming. She found that man and asked him to show her how to tie a knot sailors used when they were not trying to impress girls. He taught her with sulky competence. She asked his name. He gave it suspiciously. She said thank you, in a voice that made the word sound like what it would taste like if it had been stew. He blinked and forgot his habits for an hour. It is a rare kindness to make a man forget his habits and an even rarer wisdom not to do it often. Arya left him with enough of himself that he went home to his sister and did not show off. At the wall, the lamps glowed in their line as if the ice had decided to grow itself some stars. Jon stood on the low hill and watched them go one by one into the distance until distance itself had to admit they were there. He had a whistle in his pocket and a length of rope in his hand. The boys had learned to say aye and move when he spoke a word along the ridge, and the men had learned not to be offended by being taught because he had learned not to do the teaching in a way that made a man feel smaller than his usefulness. Dolorous Ed had asked if the wall would like to learn to sew, and if so would it make him a scarf, and John had smiled without meaning to and said that if the wall took it into its head to knit, he'd ask it please to make them socks without holes. Tormund, who had become a friend in the way men become friends when they both choose to raise their voices and then discover silence does a better job, had said, "If the wind keeps doing what it's doing, we'll all be wearing our beards on our feet." The tracks beyond the tree line were not tracks the way a deer leaves tracks. They were marks like a thought pressed into the crust of snow, and when you tried to press your own boot into the same shape you found you couldn't and then used your boot anyway and felt foolish. They curlicued in a pattern that made a man's scalp pull tight and then refused to be looked at directly for long. John had learned not to follow them to their ends because he suspected they didn't have ends. He marked their beginnings, then, whenever they appeared, he taught his men to do the same. He taught them to say this and not this and to call him when they were tempted and not to be ashamed of being tempted. It would have been easier, perhaps, to pretend he had a name for the thing that left them. It would have been worse. He wrote again to Bran and to Ned and to Sansa because he had learned to spread the weight. He wrote less to Arya because to her he would only have said what he could not bite back, that he wanted her to keep her head far from whatever this was, and keep her face under the sky where it could look at a star instead of at the wrongness that had learned the edge of their world's name. To Bran, he wrote that the reed had hummed in a way his men could hear because Reed had told him to hold it against his throat where a man's voice starts. The hum had made the throat feel less alone. He thought that precious, and he told Bran so. Bran read the letter in the afternoon light that came through the solar window like warm cloth and closed his eyes afterward. He let the reed rest against his skin and felt, for a moment, the way a secret sits in a room before anyone has said it aloud, the weight of it, and the invitation it makes to someone's mouth. He took it away and breathed and thought of the small stone he had set in the river's path 2 nights before, and of how 1,000 such small stones might make a man think he had a wall that could keep out a flood. He was not foolish enough to believe the work stopped with stones. He put the reed away like a man puts away a tool he will want to find without thinking about it later. The deserter, if that was yet his name, learned to dig a proper ditch. He learned, too, that a ditch had to be thought of as a thing a child might fall into, and that meant building it with a slope if you were clever and a man could scramble out again. He came to Bran one day with a look of a man who had seduced a problem and regretted it. "There's a place," he said, "where the water runs and then stops and then runs again. If I widen the mouth of the ditch, I can let it run, but that eats the bank and then the path. If I make it narrower, the path is safe and the water sits and sulks and then comes at me all at once and knocks down what I've just put up. I have been taking turns being the water and the ditch all morning, and I need to be a man again." Bran walked out with him and looked at the place and put his hand against his thigh where the reed in his pocket hummed once. Not because there was a secret in the ditch, but because there was a mistake in the man who had thought he could make the water behave like a person. "A good ditch looks like it was built by someone who knows he'll have to come back next spring," he said. "Let it run slow here, let it run quick there. When it runs quick, it needs stones it can trip over, otherwise it thinks it has rights it doesn't." The man nodded and did as he was told. He went home with mud on his boots and pride under it. He did not run that night. He sat in a corner of the hall and listened to a boy tell a story about a dog that had learned to open a door by sheer repetition. He laughed, just once, at a place where a laugh was not called for, and then looked at Bran with fear in his eyes and then relief when Bran looked back at him without malice. He would leave in the night and come back by noon a month from now. He was that kind of man. In between, he would do a piece of work that would stand a winter and make a woman bless him under her breath without knowing his name. That was the best you could do for some men. Give them a piece of the world to put their hands to and a place to set it down when their hands began to ache. The pup under the bitch's leg insisted on living. Bran was content to be impressed by his lack of imagination about the alternative. He brought him small pieces of bread soaked in milk and made the other pups wait a heartbeat before they shoved their noses in. The kennel master watched and said nothing and thought, privately, that the boy was a better surgeon than half the men who had called it themselves by that word in his lifetime. In King's Landing the steward's set of rooms smelled of wax and ink and a little of scorched bread. There was a fire in the grate and a map on the table and a man with his boots off, rubbing the place above the heel where good boots bite a man who has been walking with thinking on his face. He was not a king. He did not want to be. He was something more difficult, which was a person men could point to when they wanted to believe that decency had found an office to sit in. He wrote, with his careful hand, a letter he did not send yet, because he did not know if the letter would make anything better. He sealed another letter with red wax and did send it, because it concerned the price of grain, and you do not wait when you can fill a stomach. He put his hand over his eyes and thought of the North and of the way quiet got built. He had been told once that power was a chair. He had since discovered that it was a broom. Into this gentle, working world, small events went on happening as if they owed no man a warning. A girl in the village found her mother's ribbon where Bran had picked it up and given it back. And because she did not lose it, she had some small extra luck with her butter the next day and with her husband's mood. A fox returned to its den and found its kits whole because a dog that might have been interested had been diverted by a boy with a whistle who had found a use for it beyond a joke. A stone slid in a ditch and lodged at an angle that would carry water away from a path in the thaw without washing it out. If a man wanted to find the hinge the world turned on, he could stand and watch each moment for a year and not see what he expected to see. Peace was a series of improvements too small to put on a banner, and banners were less interesting than they looked. At night, when the household was mostly asleep and the fire wanted to live without being watched, Bran took the reed and went to the godswood. The face of the heart tree looked the way a face looks when it has grown so old it has decided it won't pretend to be anything but what it is. He set the reed down on the roots and laid his hand on it and felt for a hum. It came like the feeling you get when someone has entered the room behind you and stopped at the threshold without deciding whether to knock. Not threatening, not shy, not confident. It was a thing that liked its own idea of itself and had not decided yet whether it liked the idea of men. He breathed with the tree and let it feel his breath. He sent, as he had learned to do, not words but the shape of a day, rope coiled, a boy's whistle, the sound of a woman's mouth when she told a boy he'd be useless without fingers, the slap of a hand against a horse's neck, the quiet when two men stood together and did not speak. He did not send the square. He did not send anything that would make the river jump its banks with the memory of a blade. He sent only the shape of ordinary life, and he lay very still and put nothing of himself into it except the desire that ordinary life continue. The hum faded to a readiness. Somewhere beyond the wall a boy said "I" when his name was called and did not feel alone doing it. Somewhere in the neck a raft moved a little easier over a patch of water that had thought about being a nuisance and decided to be less one. It wasn't magic. It was attention. When Sansa returned from the quay, her gloves smelled of stone and her hair of salt. She went to her mother and sat on the settle and put her head on Catelyn's shoulder the way she had when she was small, though she had taught herself not to do it every day because each time she did it might have to stand for a week. "The men at the quay think the sea likes them," she said, amused and tired. "I told them if they pleased me and the mason and the sea and their wives, they could be as proud as they liked. I think they will be pleased to have 4 opinions to please instead of the one they carry in their pockets." "You are good at that," Catelyn said. "You take men's pockets away from them and leave them their coats." "I count," Sansa said simply, "and I do not mind being the woman who counts." "You count and you sing," Catelyn amended gently. "You think I don't hear you humming when you write? All good counters hum. You can't keep numbers in a cage. They sulk." Sansa laughed. "I met a woman who puts a net of shade over her sister when she eats," she said. "It made me think about the things we do for the people we love that look like nothing to anyone else. We should have a word for those." "We do," Catelyn said, her fingers finding Sansa's braid and smoothing it. "We call them days." Before she slept, Sansa wrote a letter to the wall that included the names of 5 women in the north who would send sweet things that wouldn't rot to 5 men who had given her their names by arrangement because she had asked Hallis to ask, and Hallis had a way of asking that made men feel seen without feeling vulnerable. She wrote a note to Asha that simply said, "We will put in the clause about the nails, and if anyone asks you may point out that women are better at noticing small thefts," and Asha sent back 3 words, "You're not wrong." She wrote to Arya and told her that she had held her mask and taken it down from its peg and looked through it at a ledger, and that the ledger had seen differently for a moment. And she wrote to Tyrion and asked whether he had ever been scolded by a woman with the air of a man who had invented scolding. He replied that he had been and that he had enjoyed it more than was strictly seemly. News from the south moved like light filtered through water. It was true and it wriggled. There were men who wanted titles and men who had titles who wanted a way to set them down without giving up the small respect the title made their sons show them. There were traders who wanted to be told someone would watch the roads with interest and who wanted to be trusted to be their own watchman. There was a lord in the West with a temperament entirely unsuited to peace who had learned to hunt and to breed dogs and who would need eventually to be given a task that did not smell of blood. There was a whisper of the name of a boy who had once sat on a chair with a sword before him and who now lived somewhere he could not spoil, because a man with a patient beard had decided that what the world needed from that boy was nothing, and had arranged for the boy to have as much of nothing as could be safely managed. The chair gathered dust that men swept without talking about who would sit in it next if anyone had to. There were festivals that celebrated the harvesting of a crop instead of the crushing of an enemy. Men still wore metal plates and sharpened their knives, but they sharpened their tongues more often and found that more useful and more fun. In the yard, Theon taught the stable boy with the bad dreams 2 tricks you can use when a ghost is in your hand. Shake it as if it were a coal, and then write its name in the dirt, and then rub it away with your boot. It doesn't banish the ghost, he told the boy, because ghosts don't live in the dirt. But it tells your hand that you've done something, and hands like that. The boy nodded and didn't sleep better, but he slept differently, which sometimes is all a man can ask for. Arya found her way up the coast to a village where the women mended nets and the men mended their husbands. She watched a woman hold her tongue when a man said something foolish, and then hold a needle when his boot split, and then hold her husband in a bed where the wind came in under the door, and she thought this is something we do with our lives. She put on her mask and danced in the square to make the children laugh. A boy asked if she were a bird, and she said, "No, I am a girl with a bird's nose." And the boy said, "My father has a pig's nose," and everybody laughed the way a community laughs when a child is rude and something gentle is made out of it instead of a bruise. A man asked her what she thought of the road. She told him the road was asking questions, and she had not decided which ones to answer yet. He respected her too much to be put off by that. On the 5th night, sleep found Bran easily because the day had taken his body out and rung it like a bell. He did not go down to the roots. He dreamed nevertheless, but it was not the old place. It was a stretch of the forest beyond the wall where the trees grew close and the snow lay over the ground in a way that made everything look like a hand had smoothed it. There was a print in it, not like a foot, and around the print the air trembled the way air trembles above something hot, only it was cold, and what trembled was not light but attention. He woke with the taste of iron in his mouth and got up and crossed the floor in bare feet to the window. The stars were out. He could hear a dog snore. He put his palm against the glass and left a print there that misted and then thinned. In the morning he told Ned only, "There is a thing that would like to be looked at and also would like to be not looked at." Ned's eyes were steady. "Then we must learn to look at it in a way that suits it," he said. "And suits us." "I have a reed," Bran said with a half smile. "You have me," Ned said, which was the better thing to say. A raven came to the rookery with a thin ribbon on its leg and a message tied underneath in a boy's careful hand. Bran untied it and smoothed it without reading, the way he always did when he wanted the paper to feel as if it had been respected, and then read. It was from Samwell, who had learned to spend his terror like coin. He never spent all of it in one place. He wrote of the boys teaching one another to thread needles without bleeding on the wool, and of a story an old man had told about a time when the night had come into the woods and turned men into things that walked and forgot that they were men. He did not say the word because he did not want to make the page cold. He asked for books. He said, apologetically, that the boys wanted something to read when the lamps were lit and the talking was done. He said he had begun to write out recipes for stews that could put a man's heart back in his chest after he had thought it had fallen down to his knees, and he thought maybe that would count as a book if the grown men would not mind. Sansa sent him a crate with 2 old romances that had lost their heroes but kept their good buttered bread scenes, and with 6 booklets she and the woman with the knife mouth wrote together. How to patch a glove, songs for rope cutting, the way to notice a crack in a lantern before it burns your hand, stories to tell boys so they do not make themselves larger by lying. She added an inkpot and 2 bundles of quills and 3 letters from people whose sons were on the wall and who did not know what to say except "I love you and I work every day," as if that work means I am near you. She told Samwell to write 1 book himself. a book she would bind in leather if he sent her the pages one by one. In the midst of these threads being woven, there was, as there always is, the small tearing somewhere that asks to be mended. A barn roof caved under a load of snow that a lazy man had not learned to shake off, and 3 lambs were crushed and a girl's heart with them. There was nothing to be done but stand with her in the ruin and let her say the words that every people say when something ordinary and precious has been made into meat by something ordinary and indifferent. The man who had been lazy did not come forward. Bran did not send for him. The next day the man fixed the roof, and 3 days later, he brought the girl a pup from a litter not his and did not say sorry with his mouth. But his hands were raw, and he had the look of a man who had learned not to be lazy for a week. You could not demand more than a week. A week! On laziness makes habits, and some habits stick. Howland Reed went down to the river with Bran one more time before he took to the water. He showed Bran the way you can step on a tussock that looks like it will hold and then find it will not, and how you should plan for both outcomes by keeping your knees soft. They walked until the river was the kind of friend that this river is. The kind you can turn your back on only if you keep your ear turned too. Howland put his hand on Bran's head, and then on his heart, and then on the reed that lay between them. "You are made of woods and made of people," he said. "Don't let the woods forget you are made of people. Don't let the people forget you are made of woods." He kissed Bran's forehead the way a father kisses a son when no one is there to laugh at him, and then he went back into his green world, and the river, greedy for names, took his like a prize and hid it among its stones so that it could bring it out later to show off. Winter's early festival came like a kindness drafted by the weather and signed by the people. There was a tree, not a heart tree, that they decorated with little bits of old cloth, each a wish with a knot in it. There were many knots this year because men had learned to knot and to untie. There was stew, and there were drums, and there were children who practiced pretending to be things they weren't so they could grow into what they were without frightening themselves. Arya was not there and was there in stories. Someone said she had slapped a man with her glove for taking an apple and then given him another apple and told him to think hard about taste. Sansa was there and sang under her breath, and one song crawled into the bones of the hall and set up house because it belonged there. Theon did a foolish dance that made 4 children believe better of him. Tyrion told a story he pretended was about someone else that made a man who needed to laugh do so and then not apologize afterward. Ned stood with a cup and watched his family and looked as if someone had opened a door in his chest to let the heat in. After, when the last candle had been pinched and the last crumb kidnapped from a plate and the last child had been carried like a sack of grain snoring on a shoulder, Bran walked the wall and then went into the godswood and set his back to the tree. The reed hummed, faint as a midge, and then was silent again. He did not go down. He sat, a person under a tree in his own place, and loved that truth. Far north, a lamp guttered and went out and was relit because a man had learned the habit of it. The tracks beyond the trees made another curlicue. This one resembled the first curl of a letter in a language no one had written for a long time. It might have been a word. It became snow. The wind moved, said nothing in a voice Jon could hear. He stood on his hill, which was not a hill so much as a place where a man's perspective changed, and said I to no one and went to bed and slept without dream, which was a mercy and a preparation. On the 6th morning after Arya left, a courier from Gulltown came with a letter for Sansa that smelled faintly of fish and ink and arrogance. It was from the harbor master's son, who was trying to learn how to be indispensable and had not yet acquired the habit of gratitude. He told Sansa how he had oiled the harbor chain and how his idea had saved 3 ships and how perhaps she could use his method in White Harbor. He did not mention the 5 men who had hauled on the rope until their hands bled or the woman who had thought to send them the oil. Sansa read the letter and then wrote him back with tidy courtesy. I am glad your chain got its due. I have sent 5 pairs of gloves to the men whose hands you used. Next time, include their names in your letter. The harbor eats men who think they were alone in doing a thing. She sealed the letter with a private satisfaction that had nothing to do with the boy himself and everything to do with a world in which such letters could be sent without setting a fire. Asha came to Sansa later that day grinning like a woman who has told a joke to someone who deserved it and had seen the laugh take hold 2 breaths too late. I've your claws about nails, she announced, tossing a roll of vellum onto the table. And the one about men who weigh grain with their thumbs on the scale. And the one about the man who thinks he can sleep in the storehouse if he is guarding the ropes. He'll guard them in the courtyard, where the ropes can listen to him snore. You are a mercy, Sansa said, and meant it. If mercy can be shaped like a cudgel. It can, Asha said cheerfully. The trick is to deny men the satisfaction of the bruise. Let them feel silly. They hate that more than pain. Do you hate that more than pain? Sansa asked, curious. No, Asha said honestly. I hate being bored more than both. She cocked her head, eyeing Sansa with frank appraisal that had learned to score for wit. You're less bored than you were as a girl. I thought I wanted to be a story, Sansa said. Then I learned I wanted to be the part of the story that kept other people from falling out of it. Engineering, Asha said approvingly. We all took you for a singer who could be used to soften a man's temper, and then discovered you're the bar that the song hangs from. Sansa flushed half with embarrassment and half with pride. I can be both, she said. That's when you're most useful, Asha said. When you can put your hand on a man's shoulder and tune him without his dignity quite noticing. The talk turned to small pirate matters and the cost of tar and what to pay boys for carrying messages. Asha had opinions. Sansa had ledgers. Between the two of them, the quay got built, and when it was built, men carried barrels across it with their hands in the right place and their feet going where they should, and looked out at the sea and thought this will do. The sea did not say tea. Thank you. It did not need to. In the third week, a messenger from the south came with a letter whose seal had been pressed by a signet that had once meant more than it did, and now meant only a certain sort of obligation. Ned opened it alone. He read it twice. He took it to Catelyn and put it in her hand. She read it with her jaw set. They would like you to come, she said without attempting to undecorate the sentence. They would like to borrow a name, he said, and a way of breathing. He had the look of a man trying to decide whether to be cautious or bold. He was not afraid of either impulse. He feared only choosing the wrong one for this day. Will you go? She asked. He looked up at the window and the light through it, and the way it made patterns on the floor that never repeated exactly because clouds are suggestible creatures. It would be good for them to see a man who is not excited by rooms, he said wryly. It would be good for them to see a man whose boots have mud on them in a place where men think dirt comes from disobedient servants. It would be bad for our habit of staying out of arguments we don't have to win. Bran stood at the door and did not pretend he had not heard. If you go, he said, speaking slowly because he did not want to rush the words, you will come back. That is not an omen. That is a requirement. Ned looked at him, and the look had the weight of a hand on his shoulder. If I go, he said, I will come back. If I cannot say those words and mean them, I won't go. Catelyn stood and went to the hearth and scraped the ashes to one side and put another log on, because that was the kind of woman she was. She dealt with large decisions by looking a small fire in the face and making sure it had what it needed. If you go, she said, still looking at the flame, I will send you with soup in a jar and a shawl, and you will laugh at me, and then you will use both. Ned smiled in the way he had learned to smile when he had nothing else to put into a moment to keep it from floating away. I always use your shawls, he said, and because he had said always and meant it, Catelyn let herself sit again as if she weren't sitting on a tinderbox. They decided, after a night, that Ned would not go now. He would write. He would send a man whose skill was to look unimpressed in polite company and to be useful without showing off. Tyrion, weary of King's Landing but loyal to the way it was getting better, offered at once. They are less tempted to rob you if they are busy determining whether you are summoning mercies or mischief when you smile, he told Ned. And I can tell them no with a cough better than you can tell them no with a speech. He went with 2 men and a large store of patience, and a small piece of dried lemon peel he had taken from Catelyn's kitchen because he liked to chew on bitterness and turn it into something that tasted like something else. What will you tell them? Sansa asked privately, bringing him a loaf wrapped in cloth he could touch without being accused of sentiment. That long dinners make a man stupid, he said cheerfully. That boredom is dangerous, and so is excitement. That if they would like no one to be murdered in alleys, they should pay men to clean the alleys. That if they want their fine cloaks admired, They should bring their cloaks to the river and show them to women who have never seen such cloaks. The women will not say anything, and their silence will teach them more than 1,000 compliments. That they should lower the price of bread instead of raising the price of sugar. He tugged a curl at his neck and looked uncharacteristically sober. That they do not need a king as long as they have someone to watch the hinges and oil them before they squeal. Tell them, Sansa said slowly, choosing her words as if the letters would be counted, that we do not need their permission to be good. Oh, I will, Tyrion said, but slowly and with dessert. When he left in his sled with small bells that didn't jingle because he'd had the clappers removed, there was a feeling in the yard of breath going with him. It was not dependence. It was the way a household notices when a wise fool removes himself and takes his ability to laugh at men's worst instincts along the road. The winter deepened with a steady hand. It did not come in a rush. It came like a guest who has the right to invite himself and does so politely. Men pulled their caps down and thanked their boots. Women put another shawl in baskets as they went to visit. Children learned the trick of staying still long enough that chilblains gave up and someone put their hands to work. The sun rose late and left early and made a point of being handsome in between to make up for its lack of hours. At the wall, the tracks made another letter that might have been a name and might have been an instruction. Jon did not follow them. He stood and watched the trees, and in watching them without fear, he took some of the fear from the boys beside him. He warmed his hands over a brazier and learned to be generous instead of possessive with the heat, moving aside to let a boy he did not much like warm his own hands first. He taught himself not to count his own generosity against the boy later. That was a part of peace too. Learning not to keep score in places where keeping score makes you poor. He dreamed once of a square and a wind, though he had never been there in this world. He woke with a tightness in his chest that was not fear, and he went out to the wall and stood in the dark and said to it, in the way men talk to things they have chosen to love, "We will not be careless." The wall said nothing. It had always been best at silence. The pup won his name by refusing 100 names. Children tried them on him like hats, and he shook each one off his head and looked at them as if they were the ones who had the wrong idea about their own ears. In the end, Bran called him not Bika. He made difficulties of his own and then solved them by stubbornness, and because he joined things without asking permission, and because he had been born in a mess and bound himself to it and made it into a story worth repeating. Not accepted the name with more dignity than was altogether flattering for a dog. Arya came back downriver a month after she left, arriving at Winterfell with a face that had been near a salt wind and hands that had done 100 small, respectable labors. She had told stories and been told stories, and had learned the names of 5 knots and 3 songs you can sing without sounding as if you were trying to be noticed. She had found the man with the whistle's name and written it on a piece of leather with a burnt stick and put it in Hallis's ledger so that when the man came, as he would, to blow his whistle and earn a day's work fetching water, Hallis could pretend to remember him by name and make him feel large with it. She walked into the hall and put her cheek to her mother's cheek without making a fuss of it, and then took her mask off its thong and hung it up on its peg. And that, too, had weight. Sansa gave her a roll of paper as if it were a cake. It contained a list of the names of men who had tried to steal nails and the inventive little punishments Asha had invented to make them more bored than injured. Arya felt as if she had been given a hymn. She and Bran went out to the Godswood where the snow had made the world quiet even before they had decided to be quiet. She lay down on her back and looked up and said, "I thought of calling something mine and decided not to. Then I thought of calling something ours and decided that would take too many words." "Words are a form of weather," Bran said. "They are," she agreed with mock gravity. She turned her head. "Do you still touch the river when you think you should? Do you still leave it alone when you think you must?" "I do," he said. "I like leaving it alone better." "That's new." She made a pleased sound. "Good. I like leaving men alone, too, unless they are doing something that makes me want to be rude. There was a man in White Harbor who..." She told him a story of a man and a boat and an idea about how the sea owed him a favor and how he had been taught by his wife to owe the sea a favor instead, and Bran listened the way a person listens to a fire, letting it warm him and rearrange his thoughts. That night, under the weight of a sky as dark and clean as hammered iron, Bran dreamed again, only a little. It was not a warning or an invitation. It was the sense of somebody, somewhere, learning a word with their hands and then practicing it with their feet. He woke with a bruised sort of joy because a new thing being learned is always a joy, and bruised because he would have liked to see it and he had taught himself not to go unless he was needed. Winterfell breathed. The realm they had made went on being a realm, which is to say a boundary, a promise, a habit, a place to stand. It was ruled without ruling, and the people in it did not go on their knees except when a thing had fallen on the floor and needed picking up. They made soup and rope and stories. They wrote letters. They did not think much of kings. They thought of weather and of whether the weather would be kind and, if not, how they might be kind to one another to make up the difference. Bran sat with his back to the heart tree and let that be enough, which, for now, it was.